Well, Gio, what's your take on the theory of forms? Let's start there.
There's certainly a there's certainly an amount of scholarship uh, that sort of tries to reconcile the works of Carl Jung with Plato. Um, in sort of the eidos, the idea is certainly a transcendental that has carried on into the psychological framework of Jungian depth psychology. Oh god. Well, at least it's a censored photo. Anyways, but the problem would be that Plato is, of course, specifically talking about a metaphysics, whereas Jung, I would like to believe that there is a metaphysical aspect to it, but of course, Jung, a lot of people call him like the psychologist, the Platonic psychologist, because he's basically psychologizing universal archetypal forms that are found throughout the world and bringing them to a purely psychological framework rather than a metaphysical framework. But there definitely is sort of a symbiosis there. There's certainly a dialectic. There's similarities between Jungian archetypes and the Platonic theory of forms. But yet, I would say that they're for different reasons and therefore entirely different structures. And so it's very easy to get lost in comparisons. In other words.
Well, with the Jungian archetypes, how would you define those in a like as simply as you could? Like, what
Hmm.
exactly are these archetypes?
Well, that's the thing. If you look at archetypes in the collective unconscious, they're basically the Greek word eidos, the ideal. They're basically the molds that have transcended throughout human history, but they're ever changing and ever present, and they have a unique relationship to their manifestations throughout history. So, for example, every and but yet there are sort of the positives and the negatives because every archetype has a shadow side that inevitably leads to ruin, and so but yet it could be immensely positive if you stay along a certain course. So there's the archetypes are meant to place a lot of this content throughout the world found in world mythology and psychology and religion. It is meant to highlight not just the similarities, but there's something the deeper pull within the well of the collective throughout human history. And so here's a quote from Jung to address Plato. This is from Memories, Dreams, Reflections. Now, I highly recommend getting that because that's sort of the later Jung's work, where it's like a very neat package for normies to get involved with Jung's thought. So he said here, above all, I was attracted to the thought of Pythagoras, Heraclitus, Empedocles, and Plato, despite the long-wittedness of Socratic argumentation. Their ideas were beautiful and academic, like pictures in a gallery, but somewhat remote. Only in Meister Eckhart did I feel the breath of life, not that I understood him. And so this is Jung in dialogue with other depth psychologists. Then he goes on to say the origins of consciousness means the origins of value and signification. And you find these concepts as well as coined in the early philosophy, because Plato was close to the origin of philosophic consciousness. So Jung had an affinity for Plato and he had affinity for Immanuel Kant. He became a voracious studier of Kant in his earlier years. And if you look at his letters in the Zoffingia Society, which is the psychology society in his University of Zurich, I believe. And so Plato became a foundational thinker for Jung's depth psychology. And this is where he sort of broke from the Freudian tradition in a lot of ways because he thought that the unconscious possessed what Plato was basically describing, but he psychologized it because philosophic consciousness is very close to the project of what depth psychology is involved in. Hence why you will get more Freud and even to an extent Jung in the philosophy departments or in the literature departments than you would in psychology because psychology nowadays is mostly like cognitive behavioral and like science and
Would you
neuroscience.
say it's a soft science? I remember Jules referred to it as a soft science before. Like, I don't know if it's
What's a soft science?
psychology.
Anything you can't measure with anything you can't measure is soft science.
No, I think that it's hard to say because I would say that the word science itself has sort of become bankrupt. In terms of like soft and hard science, it basically is like the softest of science, because the whole point of the modern science is replicated. Oh, I can't talk. Replicatability. And so psychology is notorious for having like, basically you could have a study about whatever you want to say, in terms, because psychology has been brought out of the realm of philosophy, has been brought out of the realm of theology, and now it's become a quote unquote soft science. And so now they have to play catch up with the nerds in lab coats hooking wire heads to people. And so that's the problem. I think that psychology itself has become sort of an abused science, and the sort of psychoanalysis, I don't know how it's like in Europe. I think in Europe there's still a bit more of it, but outside of like DIY circles, like Jung institutes in North America, psychoanalysis isn't even like paid mind to anymore. Like it really is just cognitive behavioral stuff and neuroscience and things of that nature, and psychopharmacology. It seems that psychoanalysis is largely the realm of like studies departments nowadays. And so yeah, it becomes complicated. But definitely, yeah, I would say go and read Archetypes in the Collective Unconscious. If anything, if you had to just read one book of Jung, it would probably be that one, right?
Well, we had Drew Arnold on a couple of months ago where he was talking about how somebody like, let's say, Plato, for instance, he says that he studied in these various Egyptian mystery schools, and that was the origin of a lot of the ways that he saw life. And I understand that there is a difference between the way that Jules sees the theory of forms, and I understand, Jules, where you say, like, the way that I see the theory of forms is one that you would be a lot more agreeable with than the way that...
As a theory, I think you're proposing a different theory that doesn't fit into the theory of forms that I find very coherent. And then I try to differentiate that from the theory of forms the way it's, I mean, like, we should just read it Andy Kaufman style on our stream, and we should just like have a theory of forms episode, okay? Because you gotta start with the source text here.
Well, here's another quote. Here's an actual quote from Archetypes in the Collective Unconscious. This is later on in the book. He said, "But the very fact that this process is unconscious gives us the reason why man has thought of everything except for the psyche in his attempt to explain myths. He simply didn't know that the psyche contains all of the images that have ever given rise to myths, and that our unconscious is an acting and suffering subject with an inner drama which primitive man rediscovers over and over by means of an analogy in the process of nature, both great and small." So what Jung is saying is that, and I know, like, you know, post-colonial studies, blah, 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 Edward Said, Orientalism, let's just bracket that for a moment. What Jung is saying is that quote-unquote primitive man in tribal societies, they live entirely unconsciously. And he actually went to Africa and he studied a lot of these pygmy tribes. And so unconscious man lives entirely externally and within the unconscious. There is no sense of individualism in a lot of tribal structures. He said only modernity produced a seismic shift in terms of our development and thinking in bringing people towards a consciousness that is individuated towards a particular contextual existence. There no longer is the meta-narratives that are keeping us towards a certain interpretation that integrates these forms and these archetypes. And this is why I think, above all, it would be controversial to say, but because people think of Jung as an essentialist. In a way, Jung is the ultimate essentialist. But I think that Jung can be integrated within a postmodern context.
Can you define essentialist, though? What is essentialist?
Well, because he believes that there is an essence within the heart of being itself that is in the collective unconscious, that these archetypes are real and they are trans-historical, meaning that they exist beyond time and place and context.
Kind of like
really
the forms.
Are the most exactly like the forms, yes. So, but yet at the same time, I think that there is at least a partial hint of postmodernism, certainly an anti-modernism within Jung, in terms of the way these forms manifest within society. This is why he was so preoccupied with the UFO phenomenon before he died in 1962 at the tender age of, like, I think he was 86 or something like that. Yeah. And he also had a dialogue with Alan Watts before he died, which is really pretty interesting. So,
But when it comes to these forms, since we were talking about the mystery schools that Plato attended and meditation practices that I have also gone through, as I've talked many times during these streams, what interests me is where we're headed right now, and I don't think everybody's headed that direction, but if we started out in this much more dream state, like a collective dream state where we were in a tribe, or even when like we were in the Bronze Age, and people were hearing the voices of various gods, at least according to somebody like, what's his name, Julian Jaynes, who has that theory about the bicameral mind, where the mind was split, so they'd receive information from their right hemisphere into their left as if the gods were talking and commanding them. So it's always interesting for me to think about this, and I've talked about this more than once, about how some people now are getting to the state of they're aware of themselves as outside this dream state, almost like you were consciously dreaming, like you're having a lucid dream, where we were once dreaming the dream, now we're lucidating the dream. And the question is, what comes after that period of lucidity, of seeing you as the separate being apart from whatever dream state you happen to be in? What exact, like I know John Gebser has a theory on what comes afterwards when it comes to like existing four-dimensionally, and I haven't read the full book yet. The what was that book called? The I have it right here on
bicameral mind. Yeah.
No. John. Oh, the ever-present
origin.
Yes. So in that one, he talks about how humans are going to get to this next level where they'll be able to live four-dimensionally. Whatever that means, I'm still not sure yet. I don't think it's going to be, if some change occurs, I really don't think, like I said before, it's going to be everybody. I think different people are in different places, in their lives. So, but I assume that there may be some change that we're going to go through at a certain point, because we're in a different place now than we were back then in terms of the various things that people can experience in an embodied existence. It would be interesting for us to experience something beyond what we're used to, especially at this time that the internet is slowly, I think, turning a lot of minds into jelly, just because people are just constantly, like I know, Yams, you were talking before about how there is something to the state of being within the wired, but the only counterpoint I would add to that is it's possible, I think, to be both within the wired and at the same time be outside of the wired in your regular life. Because if I just turn my head for a second, I see that we're actually in a three-dimensional world, which is completely lost on me when I'm just seeing this. It's not good for your eyes, and it's also, I think, not that good for your brain, too, just to always be hooked in. But if you're partly hooked in, and then the other part you're, like, meditating and stuff, that could be the new world. The new world could be one where some people meditate for a hell of a long time and then spend the rest of the time online. So I don't know.
Oh God, we become human batteries.
Well, I wouldn't think any differently from those people than the people that go to live in a mountain to, like, just be in a temple with monks, and they just put on that gown and then they're drawing circles in sand all day.
Well, that's a good question.
The point is to be so apathetic about mortality and your own death that it becomes impossible for you to think about, like, wasting your time. Like, that's the test of your inner peace, is that you don't mind sitting and doing nothing.
I wouldn't say it's doing nothing, though. Like, certainly some parts of it are, but I really think that some of those monks have been able to get to places where, to them, something like the internet is already possible without having somebody come in and install a wireless router.
Where did you get this idea of the inner internet? This is like your new kick.
It's not a new kick. It's been going on for a pretty long time. I think it's the logical conclusion of just all the practices that I've been going through right now. I really do think that something like that is possible to one day be able to tap into the dream state and be able to integrate that with a lot of people.
I don't think without a Neuralink that is possible at all. In fact, I think that when you describe your internal mind's eye, that you've been like building like a memory palace. I think every person's would be unique to them.
Completely
And I think it
closed, you're saying.
also
Never interacting. Like
I
prisons.
think I don't think it's so dark. I think that it's also shaped by the way you will it. As in, if you keep walking on the same path over and over and over again, you dig deeper grooves. You accentuate the details more and more and more, right? You saturate it more. You realize it more. So if you get an impression in your mind's eye and then you keep focusing on it, meditating on it, and you keep embellishing it, you keep adding depth to it, you'll get a very, very vivid picture in your mind. And it's the same as reports from people who do the same thing, imagining a chessboard in their mind. Like there are people who can close their eyes and have a chessboard in their mind's eye and then play a game of chess against themselves in their own mind. This is in the Brain That Changes Itself. There was a guy who was in solitary confinement for 10 years. And when he came out, he was able to speak lucidly like I am now. And the reason he wasn't like Julian Assange coming out of there, like babbling incoherently, he said was because he every day would imagine a chessboard in his mind. And every day he would just practice trying to imagine a chessboard. He wouldn't even put the pieces on the board yet until like a year had gone by. And now he's imagining the pieces on the board. And then after like 2 years go by, he's imagining like moving pieces. And then it came to the point when he was playing chess games. And then when he got out, he was like a chess phenom. He had never played chess in 10 years other than in his own head. And I think if you just focus on meditating what you can see in your head, like you might create a tunnel, you might create some helix pictures, and there might be something that was externally inspired, but that's not some kind of internal internet. That's your brain. That's an ocean in a drop. That's what you are.
But your take is that ocean in the drop wouldn't have connection with any other ocean as far as interactivity goes. That's where you draw the line.
I think there can be spooky action at a distance. I think that because it's been demonstrated to me. It's been demonstrated to me that you can entangle atoms and you can separate them any distance, and if you affect one, you affect the other the same exact way. That's what Einstein called spooky action at a distance. That is quantum entanglement, and they've demonstrated that you can quantumly entangle biological cells. So if you're telling me that you have an identical twin and that identical twin like has his arm chopped off, and then suddenly like you feel a sickness and you can't explain it, and then it's like, oh, you find out later at the time you were feeling this sickness thousands of miles away, something horrific was happening to your twin, like that could be explained through a quantum entanglement, right? You can explain these things materially.
But where do you disagree with me then? Where do you disagree with me?
Wait, Supermount had something to say. Jules,
I'm saying that that's not if that is an internal internet, I would prefer to use something that I would prefer to use language that is less appealing to esoterics and woo and more appealing to simple explanations that demonstrate how well you understand something.
Well, the only problem is that explanation takes way longer than just saying internal internet. And by internal internet...
It doesn't. No, it doesn't. It actually ends up taking much
you had something to
time.
say.
Yeah,
it ends up taking much less time. Because otherwise you're saying the same thing over and over and over and over again, and no one has a clue what you're talking about.
Okay, Serpent, go for it.
Internal internet.
Oh, I was just gonna say that's like a common thing that a lot of guys talked about is even like not in solitary, but in certain prisons.
In the shoe.
Yeah, in the shoe when they didn't have any they didn't have any chessboard or pieces to play with, guys would be like A2 and they would like say the piece and the movement and to the other person, and they would play whole games of chess with nothing on the board. And it was that's a pretty common thing that a lot of guys. It's not like common, but I've heard of it a few times from guys coming out of prison.
Definitely. Speaking of guys coming
That's
out
like
of prison,
in Vietnam.
Yeah,
we,
yeah.
Yeah,
Definitely not something I can do.
in Vietnam, they had prisoners that were the pilots that were captured, and they knew they have like the Morse code with tapping, and so they couldn't talk, right? So they'd be tapping on the walls to each other, and they'd like have whole elaborate like conversations with each other just by the taps code system, which is really crazy. I guess when you're in totally deprived, torturous conditions, your mind will sort of come up with anything. Like the power of the human mind under stress is amazing. Like there was this one documentary I watched with the Special Air Service in England, where he said they had this Vietnam veteran come in and give a lecture to the class, and he said like he had almost every bone in his body broken by the Viet Cong, and he was tortured. And they asked him like, "How did you survive?" He goes, "Well, basically, I just put it out of my mind, and I said this is just my body, and that's pretty much it." And it's like incredible, right?
Very spiritual. If you read those tales of like just completely impossible survival, it always comes down to a spiritual aspect.
Oh yeah, like the guy that had to cut his own arm off in the rocks.
Yeah, with a pocket knife. Oh
yeah, and they had to fucking get James Franco to do the movie.
So we have Info Warlock here. Info Warlock, thank you for joining us. I'd be interested in, and I love your picture, by the way. I'd be interested in your take when it comes to like what
Is that Kenny Powers in that one?
I think it is.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Kenny Powers, all right.
I'd be very interested in your take on this whole inner internet debacle that's going on right now with me and Jules. Like, where do you stand on something like the Akashic Records or whatever? You know what I mean? Like, when somebody says Akashic Records, not everybody knows, unless they are in the know, what exactly that means. So when I think of something like an inner internet, that's, at least for me, an easier way of explaining what I imagine could potentially happen.
Well, yeah, and I heard.
I guess that's
Jules
better than saying The Shining.
Well, Jules, you referred to the like quantum field and these kind of quantum mechanic theories, and I mean, I'm sure that those are well understood by a few people, but they're not well understood by a lot of people. And the same with these ideas of the Akashic field, which is more, it's not as accredited, so it might not seem as worthy of consideration. But I mean, I think nevertheless, I mean, these are just different words trying to reach at some kind of concept. And I think it's a shame that people kind of get lost in words and argue over words, and kind of sometimes they seem to be arguing like for and against the same thing at the same time, and it just gets so confusing. So yeah, I think that for your guys to have a proper debate, you really need to define all of your terms and you know what you're really trying to do, what concept you're trying to get at.
Past debates. We're past debate.
The time
for arguments is over.
No, but that's what words can be more destructive than a nuclear bomb. It's actually not.
In favor of
it's
what
actually not.
Right. Well, in favor of what Lev was saying, when you talk about like an inner internet, or maybe I would say inherent internet, some kind of kind of analogy for the internet that is natural and existing. Maybe it has to do with the science that we don't yet understand or have access to, but maybe we do have some sort of fundamental access to it, as in like clairvoyance or different kind of psychic, you know, abilities. There's a lot of theories about that, and I think all those are interesting theories. But personally, I just kind of try to keep my mind open and say that, and somebody's talking about quantum theory on one end, and they have a scientific background, and somebody's talking about Akashic field on the other hand, and they have kind of a new age spiritual worldview. I like to kind of listen to what they both say and think maybe they're just talking about the same thing in different languages and not realizing that they're just kind of talking past each other. So I don't know. I have like an open mind for all possibilities, I think.
Well, the spooky action at a distance that Jules mentioned, what I'm interested in to find out from Jules is where would you draw the line when it comes to what is possible with the spooky action at a distance, where my point of view is, and again, it's subject to change, but for now, my point of view is that I think it would be possible and has been possible in the past for people to, just like you have a dream and you see certain people in that dream that you know from real life, for that to actually be able to occur in an otherwise like waking state where you can voluntarily go into that place, see those people, and they wouldn't just be fragments in your head. They would be the actual people that would visit you in that state. That's what I mean more by this inner internet, and I'm curious where you would put the limitation of what's possible.
So I think that is a internal desire people have. Like, I think that's I think what you're describing is a primordial desire that people have, similar to a Gilgameshian one. But I don't think people have done it. Just like people dreamed of flight thousands of years before we ever invented flight. And then every single person that basically said, you know, only fools dream of flight. You know, just remember Icarus, guys. You know, and we take for granted that we've had flight for less than 100 years, right? So for thousands of years, people dreamed of flight. And anyone that said, hey, you know, maybe we could actually figure out how to fly, you know, these people were considered not realistic. They were out of touch. They maybe were godless, right? Like if God wanted us to fly, he'd have given
maybe
us
if they would
wings.
have demonstrated it like the Wright brothers did, then they would have been taken seriously.
Exactly. That's exactly right. So people can just talk themselves so they're blue in the face talking about internal internet. And it's, to me, like, well, are you trying to bring people there? Or
then there's
just
a lot,
sucking your own dick?
There's a huge field and debate where some people say there's a lot of evidence for psychic type clairvoyance and sixth sense stuff. I mean, it just depends on who you're willing to listen and who you think is an authority figure. I mean, it really is fairly subjective when we talk about this kind of thing.